The first murder in history was not committed by a villain. It was committed by a brother, a son of Adam. And thus, the entire human race was set on a path of destruction from the beginning. In the garden that once held everything they needed, Adam and Eve were now alone, cast out of Eden. The earth was no longer their sanctuary, but it was still the land where life could be found. And in that land, God had promised that their descendants would fill the earth, bringing forth life from the dust. And so it was that the firstborn child of Adam and Eve came into the world. Cain, a son of the earth, strong and full of life. His birth was a sign, a mark of hope that life would continue beyond the garden's gates. With the help of the Lord, Eve whispered, "I have brought forth a man." And so, Cain was born, a child destined for both greatness and sorrow. For Adam and Eve, Cain was their firstborn, a gift from the Creator that filled their hearts with wonder. A new generation, a future that had once seemed so distant, was now before them. They had seen the glory of creation, and now they were witnessing the beginning of the human story. And in time, Abel, the younger brother, was born, a tender soul, meant to shepherd the flocks, and a light to Cain's darker path. Two brothers, born of the same mother, yet already destined to walk two different roads. Where Cain was to be a tiller of the soil, Abel would tend the animals, caring for creatures with a compassion his brother would struggle to understand. The birth of Cain and Abel was a quiet beginning, the dawn of humanity's first family. But beneath the surface of their innocent laughter and tender moments, there lay a deeper truth. The journey of humankind would not be without its trials. And though they were brothers, their hearts would one day be torn apart. For the hearts of men are fickle, and even in the fullness of their love, there is a shadow that waits. The story of these two brothers would be a tale of love and rivalry, of faith and rejection, and of a tragedy that would echo through all of time. But for now, they are children, and the world before them is wide with promise. The birth of Cain and Abel was the beginning of humanity's story, a story of light and darkness, of love and loss, of the choices that shape us. And as the sun sets on this quiet moment, the winds of change begin to stir. As the years passed, Cain and Abel grew into young men. The world, once new and full of promise, was now their stage. Each of them, though bound by blood, began to walk their own path. Cain, the son of the soil, tilled the earth, working the ground with the strength of his hands. Abel, the shepherd, cared for the flocks, guiding them with a gentle spirit. Their lives were simple, but they were intertwined in the fabric of God's design. And so it was that, in the fullness of time, the two brothers brought their offerings before the Lord. It was a moment of reverence, a moment of faith, a chance to give back to the Creator, to offer the fruits of their labor in gratitude for the life they had been given. Cain brought the fruits of the ground, plucked from the soil he had tilled with his own hands. There was no fault in his offering. It was the product of his hard labor, his sweat, and his toil. Yet there was something missing. It was an offering, yes, but it lacked the heart of devotion that could truly honor the Lord. Abel, however, brought the best of his flock, his finest lamb, spotless and pure, from the firstborn of his sheep. He offered a sacrifice with love, with reverence, with the understanding that it was not the offering itself, but the heart behind it that mattered most to the Creator. The Lord looked upon Abel and his offering with favor, but Cain's gift, though sincere, did not find the same acceptance. It was not the worth of the gift that mattered, but the depth of the heart from which it came. Abel's offering was one of faith, of trust, of a willingness to give his very best. Cain's offering, though given from his labor, lacked that same spirit of devotion. Cain's face fell. His heart, once full of hope, now simmered with confusion and a budding resentment. He had worked hard, had given what he thought was enough, but it was not enough in the eyes of the Lord. And as he looked at his brother, Abel, whose offering had been accepted, Cain's heart twisted with something darker, something deeper than mere disappointment. It was envy. In that moment, Cain's heart began to change. The sting of rejection took root in his soul, and something within him began to fester. Where there should have been gratitude, there was anger. Where there should have been understanding, there was jealousy. His brother's favor became his curse. For envy, when it is allowed to grow, can consume a soul. And Cain, instead of seeking understanding, let his jealousy blind him to the truth that the Lord had not rejected him, but had simply asked for more of the heart, more of the faith, more of the devotion. Cain's anger began to boil, unchecked, unspoken. His heart, once open, now hardened like the soil he had worked. And in the dark recesses of his mind, a dangerous thought began to form. His brother had what he could never seem to earn, and he could not bear it. But Cain did not listen to the quiet voice that urged him to seek reconciliation. Instead, he allowed his envy to grow unchecked. And with that envy, there came a choice that would shape the future of humankind, a choice that would lead to the first tragedy in human history. Cain stood before the Lord, his heart heavy with confusion. He had labored long and hard in the field, pulling from the earth what he could to offer in gratitude, yet it was not enough. Abel's offering had been accepted, but his own had been passed over. His soul stirred with a painful question: why? Why was his offering rejected when it came from his toil, from his sweat, from his labor? But the Lord, seeing Cain's frustration, did not scorn him. Instead, he spoke words of warning, words of compassion. "Why are you angry?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." The Lord, in his mercy, had given Cain a chance to rise above his anger, to turn his heart toward what was right, to choose a path of faith and humility. But Cain, consumed by his emotions, did not listen. The darkness in his heart, already there, began to deepen. The Lord's words were a call to redemption, but Cain's heart was too full of pride, too filled with the poison of envy. Sin, the Lord had warned, was crouching at Cain's door, waiting for him to open it. But Cain was too blind to see the danger. Instead, he allowed his jealousy to fester, to consume him. His brother's favor became a shadow that darkened his every thought. And as the jealousy grew, so did his rage. Cain's heart was no longer a place of peace. The words of the Lord, once a gentle warning, now seemed like an accusation. How could Abel have been chosen over him? How could his brother, his younger brother, be favored? The anger in Cain's chest twisted and turned into something far darker than mere frustration. It was resentment. It was hatred. And in that moment, the seed of violence was planted. Cain, instead of seeking peace, chose the path of destruction. He called to Abel, his voice steady, yet carrying the weight of his inner storm. "Let's go out into the field," he said. And Abel, innocent and trusting, followed without question. He did not know the depth of Cain's rage, nor did he understand the darkness that had already taken root. As they entered the field, Cain's anger reached its boiling point. The world around them seemed to grow still, as though it, too, understood the weight of the moment. In the quiet of the field, with no one to hear, Cain's fury was unleashed. He struck Abel down. In a flash of violence, a life was taken. Abel, the innocent, the faithful, fell to the ground, his blood staining the earth. The first murder, the first brother to kill his own flesh and blood. Cain, in his envy, had taken the life of Abel. And as the blood of the innocent brother seeped into the earth, the very soil that Cain had once tilled with pride now became stained by his own sin. There is no undoing the harm that was done. Once the soul has been taken, it cannot be returned. And though Cain may have felt a fleeting sense of relief, a quiet moment where his jealousy was momentarily sated, the consequences of his actions would follow him forever. But even in the silence of the field, the Lord was not absent. The Creator, who saw all, spoke once more. "Where is your brother Abel?" he asked, his voice filled not with anger, but with sorrow. For the Lord knew what had happened. He knew what Cain had done. But Cain, too consumed by his guilt, tried to lie, to hide his sin from the one who saw all. Cain answered, his voice trembling, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" His words, a mix of deflection and denial, did nothing to conceal the truth. The blood of Abel cried out from the earth, and the Lord knew it. There was no hiding from what had been done. Cain's sin was laid bare, and the consequences were inevitable. The earth lay still in the aftermath of Cain's crime. The air, once filled with the sounds of life, now felt oppressive, silent, as if the world itself mourned. The blood of Abel soaked into the ground, and with it a cry for justice rose from the earth itself, reaching the ears of the Lord. The camera lingers on the field, now eerily quiet. The shadows grow longer as the sun begins to set. Cain stands alone, his hands stained, his body rigid, unable to move as the weight of what he's done presses down upon him. Cain stood in the field, his eyes wide with fear, his breath shallow. He had murdered his brother, his flesh and blood. The act, done in a moment of envy and rage, had forever changed the course of his life. The silence around him was deafening, but it would soon be broken by the voice of the Almighty. "Where is your brother Abel?" The voice of the Lord thundered, not in wrath, but in sorrow. It was not an accusation yet, but a question that carried the weight of all creation, a question that echoed in the very marrow of Cain's bones, as though the earth itself was demanding an answer. Cain flinches, his eyes darting nervously to the ground, unable to meet the gaze of the Creator. His heart pounds in his chest as panic begins to swell within him. Cain's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he could not hide what he had done, but in his fear, in his shame, he tried. He deflected. He lied. "I do not know," he said, his voice trembling. "Am I my brother's keeper?" His words were sharp, defensive, meant to mask the truth. But in his lie, Cain only dug his own grave deeper. But the Lord, who sees all, who knows all, could not be deceived. There was no hiding the truth. The Creator saw the blood that cried out from the earth, saw the sin that had been committed. And with that, the tone of the Lord's voice shifted from sorrowful inquiry to unyielding justice. "What have you done?" the Lord asked, his voice now full of sorrow and indignation. "Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." The words struck Cain like a hammer, each syllable falling with the weight of cosmic justice. His sin was no longer hidden. The blood of Abel, innocent and pure, was now a witness against him, crying out for vengeance. Cain's face contorts with a mix of dread and shame. His breath comes in short gasps. He cannot look up, cannot meet the gaze of the Creator. In that moment, Cain knew that he could no longer run from what he had done. The Lord had seen the truth, and it was laid bare before him. There was no hiding, no evading. His brother's blood had been spilled, and the earth itself bore witness to his crime. "Now you are under a curse," the Lord declared, his voice unyielding. "You are driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." The reality of Cain's fate begins to sink in. His whole world begins to crumble. The punishment was severe. The land that had once been a source of life, a source of his labor and pride, would now refuse him. The very soil that Cain had worked with his hands would turn against him, no longer yielding its harvest. His life, once full of purpose, now seemed empty, cursed. And the curse was not only physical, it was spiritual, a separation from the Lord's presence. Cain's hands tremble as the weight of his fate crushes him. He falls to his knees, his voice breaking as he speaks. Cain's voice cracked as he spoke, barely above a whisper. "My punishment is more than I can bear," he said, his words heavy with despair. "Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." And yet the Lord, in his mercy, did not abandon Cain. Though the punishment was just, there was still grace to be found. "Not so," the Lord replied. "Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." And with that, the Lord placed a mark upon Cain, a mark to protect him from those who might seek to harm him. The mark was a sign, a reminder of the weight of his sin, but also of the mercy that still lingered. So, Cain was cast out from the Lord's presence. He became a wanderer, an exile from the land of his ancestors. And though he walked the earth, his heart would never know peace. The weight of his sin, of his brother's blood, would follow him always. But even in the darkest of times, the Lord's mercy lingered, a reminder that even in the face of such horror, grace could still be found. Cain stood at the edge of the land, the earth beneath his feet, now a reminder of the blood he had spilled. The mark upon his forehead, given by the Lord in mercy, was both a symbol of his curse and a sign of divine protection. The land he had once known, the soil he had worked with pride, now turned its back on him. It would yield no crops. It would no longer be a source of sustenance, but a place of emptiness. Cain's eyes, once full of hope, now reflect the weight of his actions. He touches the mark on his forehead, tracing its shape as if it were a brand burned into his very soul. The curse upon Cain was not only one of the earth. It was also a curse of the spirit, a sense of separation, a feeling of being cast adrift, cut off from the very presence of the Lord. The Creator, who had once walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, now seemed distant, hidden behind the veil of Cain's sin. Cain walks slowly, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. There is no one beside him, no family, no home. For Cain, the world had become a place of wandering. No longer would he know the comfort of a familiar field, the joy of fruitful labor. He was cast out from the place of his birth, away from his family, and from the presence of the Lord himself. His punishment was not just the loss of the earth's bounty. It was the loss of peace, the loss of connection, and the isolation that only the guilty know. Cain's gaze shifts to the distant horizon. He knows there is no returning. There is no redemption waiting for him, only endless days of wandering, his heart heavy with guilt and sorrow. And as Cain walked, a deep sense of dread settled upon him. Though the Lord had marked him for protection, a new fear had taken root within his heart. A fear that, despite the mercy shown, others would seek to kill him, to punish him for the murder of Abel, to avenge the blood that cried out from the earth. The mark upon Cain's forehead was meant to protect him, to prevent others from exacting vengeance. But in his mind, it was a constant reminder of his sin, a living symbol of the terrible price he had paid. The world was now a dangerous place for him, even though the Lord had declared that anyone who harmed him would suffer sevenfold vengeance. Cain could not shake the fear that he was marked not just by the Creator, but by his own guilt. His soul, once unburdened, was now weighed down by the irreversible nature of his actions. Cain, once proud of his strength and his place in the world, now walked as a fugitive. His sin had turned him into an outcast, a wanderer in a world that no longer welcomed him. The earth had once opened its mouth to receive his brother's blood, but now it offered nothing but emptiness in return. Cain looks back one last time at the distant land of his father. A long sigh escapes his lips. His face is drawn with regret, his features hard, like the very earth he now walked upon. And yet, even in his exile, even in his curse, there was a flicker of life left in Cain. He did not die, not yet. The Lord's mercy, though a difficult mercy, still held him in his hand. For Cain, this mark was a reminder that there was still a future, however uncertain, however painful. Cain pauses for a moment, the weight of his thoughts evident. He takes a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort of containing the storm within him. Cain would live. He would walk the earth as a marked man, separated from his family, separated from the Lord's favor, but alive. The Lord had spared him, not for his own sake, but because God, in his wisdom, had chosen to let Cain live, to continue the bloodline, despite the horror that had transpired. But the curse would never leave him. It would follow him wherever he went, shadowing his every step. The mark on his forehead would be a reminder that no sin, no matter how hidden, goes without consequence. And though Cain might wander far from the land of Eden, far from his brother's grave, he could never escape the consequences of the choice he had made. Cain continues his journey, his back turned to the world he once knew, stepping into the unknown. The mark upon his forehead glows faintly in the setting sun, a symbol of both his punishment and his strange, reluctant protection. Cain's fate was sealed, but it was not yet finished. The path ahead was uncertain, the future unclear. But one thing was certain, his story was not over. The mark that marked him for death also marked him for life. For he was still alive, still moving, still walking in a world that had been irrevocably changed by his sin. As Cain wandered through the land of Nod, east of Eden, the weight of his curse followed him like a shadow. The ground beneath his feet was barren, the sky above him was still, and the earth, which had once been so full of promise, now felt desolate. Yet, even in this wasteland, life began to stir within him. For Cain, the journey had not ended in death. He was alive, and with life there came the possibility of new beginnings. Cain, now visibly older, walking slowly but steadily through a stark, unfamiliar land. The sun casts long, heavy shadows, and the landscape around him is vast and empty. His gaze is distant, but there's a flicker of determination in his step. Though his past was one of bloodshed, Cain was not without the ability to create. In the land of Nod, Cain found a strange, haunting freedom, a freedom born from the severance of his ties to his family and the curse that clung to him. And in that desolation, he did what he had once known best. He built. Cain laboriously shapes something from the earth. He collects stones, stacks them, and begins constructing the first stones of a foundation. His hands work steadily, but there's a certain grimness to his task. The city is being born from the dust of his exile. And so, in the land where he had been cast out, where the soil rejected him and the world seemed cold, Cain began to build a city. It was not just a dwelling place for himself, but a monument, an unspoken challenge to the curse that had been placed upon him. For in the construction of this city, Cain was trying to reclaim something of the life he had lost, trying to rebuild what his sin had shattered. Cain's face shows the mix of emotions, a tortured resolve beneath his hardened exterior, as the city slowly takes shape. He named the city after his son, Enoch, a name that would echo through generations, despite the stain of Cain's actions. In naming it, Cain unknowingly set into motion a lineage, a line of descendants that would follow him, each one born from the legacy of his sin. Cain's son, Enoch, was born into a world that carried the weight of his father's sins. As the child grew, so too did Cain's lineage. Enoch fathered Irad, and Irad fathered Mehujael, who fathered Methuselah, and Methuselah fathered Lamech. Each generation brought forth new life, but each was also touched by the shadow of Cain's curse. The city grew, its walls rising higher with each passing year. But no matter how tall they grew, no matter how much wealth or power Cain's descendants acquired, the stain of sin followed them. The blood of Abel was not forgotten. It was woven into the very fabric of their existence, a shadow that would forever touch their lives. Lamech, now a grown man, stands at the city's edge, gazing out at the horizon. There's a cold, hard determination in his expression, but something darker lurks behind his eyes. Lamech, Cain's descendant, was a man of strength, a man of violence. It was said that he took 2 wives, Adah and Zillah, and through them he fathered 2 sons, Jabal, the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock, and Jubal, the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Yet, despite the outward appearance of prosperity, a darkness, much like the one in his forefather Cain, began to fester in Lamech's heart. Lamech speaks to his wives, his voice carrying a note of grim pride. He is older now, but his words are sharp like the edge of a blade. Lamech, consumed by the weight of his own bloodline, spoke to his wives in a chilling way. His voice was full of anger, full of defiance. He said to them, Adah and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. His words were not just a claim, they were a declaration of his own violent justice. A dangerous and terrifying echo of Cain's first act of murder, now magnified. Lamech's wives, who listen in silence, their faces unreadable, though a hint of fear flashes across their eyes. Lamech's pride was undeniable. He believed, with chilling certainty, that if Cain had been avenged 7 times, then he, Lamech, would be avenged 77 times. His words, brimming with arrogance and violence, revealed just how deeply the curse of Cain had infected his bloodline. Violence had become a part of their nature, a legacy that would not be shaken. Lamech's expression, cold, calculating, as he stands tall over his wives. He believes his strength is unquestionable, and in his mind, his actions are justified. Cain's city, his legacy, had grown into something powerful, something full of life, but also full of darkness. And yet, the cycle of sin that began with the blood of Abel would continue. In the city of Enoch, despite the achievements, despite the wealth and power, there would be no true peace. The blood of Abel, once spilled upon the earth, now hung over the city like a dark cloud, an inescapable shadow that would haunt every generation. The city of Enoch, bustling with life. But in the distance, the setting sun casts a long, foreboding shadow over the city's walls. The camera lingers on the silhouette of Lamech, standing against the growing darkness. And so the city of Enoch was built, a testament to Cain's life, his curse, and his descendants. It would stand as a symbol of both man's ability to create and his capacity for destruction. The mark of Cain had not only affected his own fate, but the fate of all those who followed him, a lineage marked by violence, pride, and the haunting legacy of fratricide. And so, Cain's city grew, his descendants flourished, but the shadow of sin and violence that had begun with his brother's blood continued to loom over the earth. The weight of Abel's death pressed upon the world, and the hope for redemption seemed distant, buried beneath the crushing grief and regret of a single, irreversible act. But as darkness continued to spread, something miraculous happened. A flicker of light emerged in the midst of the gloom, a desolate, barren land where Cain once wandered. The sun begins to rise on a new day, casting golden light over the earth, as if signaling the start of something new. In the midst of their loss, in the sorrow of a son taken too soon, Adam and Eve remained. The earth had swallowed Abel's blood, and Cain's exile had left an emptiness in their hearts. Yet, though their lives had been marked by suffering, the Lord did not abandon them. In his mercy, he gave them a new hope, a new beginning. In the quiet of that moment, Eve gave birth to another son. His name was Seth, a name that would carry with it not just the promise of life, but the hope of redemption. Seth was not a replacement for Abel. He could never be. But in Seth, Adam and Eve saw a chance for something more. A chance for their line to continue, to heal, to find a new purpose after the tragedy that had scarred their family. For Adam and Eve, the birth of Seth was a sign that even in the darkest of times, the Lord could bring forth light. The earth that had once opened to consume the blood of Abel now held a new life, a new hope. Seth's birth was more than just the continuation of a family. It was a divine reminder that, though sin had entered the world, God's plan of redemption was still at work. Seth, though young, was a seed of something greater. Through him, the line of Adam would continue, but in the heart of Seth's descendants, a new calling would emerge. A calling that would not be marked by the curse of Cain, but would instead begin to reawaken the relationship between humanity and the Creator. For the first time since the fall, the desire to seek the Lord would once again stir in the hearts of men. And it was in Seth's generation that something new began to stir in the hearts of men. It was said that during his time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. The separation that had begun with Adam and Eve's fall, and which had been perpetuated by Cain's violence, seemed to lessen. For the first time in many years, there was a movement toward the divine. There was a longing to restore what had been lost, to seek the face of the Lord once more. Through Seth, a new line had begun, one that would seek the face of God, not in fear or shame, but in hope. The line of Cain had been marked by violence and the curse of fratricide, but the line of Seth would be marked by a return to worship, a return to the Creator. The promise of redemption, though distant, was beginning to take shape. And so, the story of mankind continued. Though the road was still long and fraught with challenges, the birth of Seth marked the beginning of a new chapter. It was a chapter where, for the first time in generations, people would begin to turn their hearts toward God. The blood of Abel, though still crying from the ground, would not be the final word. The hope of redemption, though fragile, though distant, had begun to take root in the earth once more. And as the people of Seth began to call on the name of the Lord, the promise of a future of redemption, of restoration, and of grace, began to emerge. From the ashes of violence, from the blood spilled by Cain, a new hope arose, and the earth, which had once been stained with sin, now carried the seed of something beautiful, a chance for the world to be made whole again. In the wake of Abel's tragic death and Cain's exile, the world seemed to grow quieter, weighed down by the shadows of sin and regret. But from the ashes of this grief, something unexpected began to stir, an undercurrent of hope. It was in the days of Seth that a new movement began, a quiet turning of hearts back toward God. The earth had been stained by sin, but through Seth, the promise of redemption began to take root. In those early days, Seth's descendants began to call on the name of the Lord. This was no grand revival, no momentous event. It was a simple, yet profound shift. People were no longer bound by the curse of Cain. Instead, They looked toward the heavens, seeking to reconnect with their Creator. The earth had long borne the marks of sin, but in these moments, the hearts of men began to seek restoration. It was through Seth that worship was redefined. It wasn't a grand spectacle, nor was it dictated by rituals or sacrifices. It was a return to the basics, the act of calling on the name of the Lord with sincerity, with reverence, and with a deep, burning desire for communion. This was a worship of the heart, a worship that transcended the outward show of religion and moved into the realm of the spirit. The longing for God grew stronger in the hearts of Seth's children. The brokenness of the past was still evident. Yet there was a growing realization that the only way forward was to seek God's face. The very act of calling on His name was a declaration of faith, an acknowledgement that, despite everything, there was still hope, that the Creator had not abandoned His creation. This was the foundation of a new legacy, a legacy not of violence or vengeance, but of faith and worship. The line of Seth would not be marked by the deeds of Cain, but by the quiet, steadfast pursuit of God's presence. As they called on the name of the Lord, they were slowly but surely rewriting the story of humanity, one prayer at a time. The people who called on the name of the Lord were few, but their hearts burned with a quiet passion. They had no great temples, no rituals to follow, but they had something more precious, a living connection with their Creator. It was in their humble prayers, their simple acts of worship, that the seeds of restoration were planted. And so, through Seth, the world began to change. It was not an immediate transformation, but a steady, patient shift. As the generations moved forward, their hearts were drawn again and again toward God. Each prayer, each humble cry, each longing for redemption was a step in the right direction. The road ahead was long, and the world was still full of pain. But in that longing for God, the seeds of healing had been sown. Through Seth, the people of the earth began to lift their eyes toward heaven once more. They began to seek what had been lost in the garden: intimacy with their Creator, peace with the divine. And in doing so, they started the long journey toward reconciliation, toward the restoration of what had been broken. The story of humanity was still unfolding, but the beginning of a new legacy was now clear. The legacy of those who seek God, who call on His name with pure hearts, and who trust that redemption is always possible. As the generations passed, the legacy of Seth began to flourish. The people who had once called on the name of the Lord now walked in the light of that calling. But, as history would reveal, even in the hearts of the faithful, the stain of sin lingered, and the shadow of violence, which had first been cast by Cain, was never fully shaken. In the line of Seth, a man named Lamech arose. He was a descendant of Seth, a man of strength and boldness, but also a man who would carry with him a darkness. While the people of Seth sought the Lord in humility, Lamech's heart was veiled in arrogance and pride, and his actions would echo the violence of his ancestor, Cain. Lamech, unlike his forefathers, was not content to quietly follow God. His heart, hardened by the years, would take a darker path. In the fullness of his pride, he would proclaim his own strength, and with it, a disturbing declaration that he had slain a man, not in self-defense, nor out of justice, but as an act of vengeance, a boast of violence. Lamech's words were chilling in their arrogance, a reflection of a heart that had been consumed not by love or reverence for God, but by a distorted sense of power. "I have killed a man for wounding me," he declared, "a young man for injuring me." And with that declaration, he not only lifted himself up, but he also challenged the very understanding of justice that had been passed down from the days of Abel's blood crying out from the ground. For in that moment, Lamech set himself in opposition not just to the will of God, but to the foundation of what it meant to live justly and rightly in the world. His declaration, a twisted echo of the curse placed upon Cain, was not just a boast. It was a deepening of the corruption that had begun with one brother's death and now spread through the generations. Lamech's words were a harbinger of something more, a deepening spiral into violence that threatened to undo all the progress made by the faithful who had come before him. He dared to say that if Cain was avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. His arrogance and pride led him to believe that vengeance was his right, not a punishment to be feared. In this moment, the echoes of Cain's curse reverberated through the generations, louder than ever. Lamech's proclamation was not one of redemption, but of further darkness. It was as though the world itself was being swallowed up in a cycle of violence, a cycle that began with Cain but would not end with him. The bloodshed that had stained the earth continued to flow, now through the boast of Lamech. And yet, even in the midst of this growing darkness, there was a faint glimmer of hope. For while Lamech spoke of violence, there were still those who sought the Lord, still those who called on his name in humility. The promise of redemption had not been erased by the arrogance of one man. Though the curse continued to echo in the blood-soaked history of humanity, the hope for reconciliation with God persisted. The world had not yet reached the depth of its fall. Lamech's sin, though severe, was not the final word. The legacy of Seth's line, of those who sought God in worship and humility, would endure. And though Lamech's words would reverberate in the hearts of men for generations to come, they would not be the foundation of the world's story. The story of redemption was still unfolding, and in the hearts of the faithful, there was still a place for hope. Though the earth was still stained by the violence of Cain's descendants, and the shadow of sin loomed large, there was a quiet undercurrent of hope, hidden in the hearts of those who sought the Lord. The story of humanity, shaped by both light and darkness, was far from over. From the line of Seth, the faithful remnant, a new chapter was unfolding. Through Seth, God had granted a new beginning. After the loss of Abel, Adam and Eve had been grieved, but with the birth of Seth, the promise of a future began to bloom once again. Seth was not just a son. He was a symbol of God's continued faithfulness, a testament to the possibility of restoration. With each new generation, the light of hope flickered, no matter how dim. In the quiet of their hearts, the people of Seth held on to the faith that God had not abandoned them. As Seth's children multiplied, so too did the desire for something greater, a desire for God's presence to be fully restored in the hearts of humanity. And it was through these faithful ones, who would continue to call on the name of the Lord, that the world would once again find its way. It was in this generation that something remarkable began to stir. The people did not simply exist. They lived with purpose, with an understanding that their lives could be part of a larger story. They yearned to restore what was broken, to bridge the chasm that had been created by sin, and to seek the face of the God who had made them. There was a deep love for the Creator, a love that would sustain them through the years to come. Seth's line was not a perfect line, and the world still carried the marks of the fall, but it was a line that chose to worship, to call on God, to look forward. The hope was not in the perfection of the people themselves, but in the faithfulness of the one they called upon. And as they did, they found that there was indeed a path forward, a path of redemption, restoration, and ultimately reconciliation with God. The faithfulness of Seth's line would continue to echo through the generations. In a world tainted by bloodshed and sin, the people who called on the name of the Lord would continue to be a beacon of hope. Their worship, humble though it was, would be the key to the healing of a broken world. And through their faith, the story of redemption, which began in the garden, would once again begin to take shape. And though the path ahead was uncertain, though the darkness of sin still loomed, there was a steady light that burned in the hearts of those who sought the Lord. The birth of Seth's descendants marked not just the continuation of a family line, but the continuation of God's promise. His promise that, despite everything, humanity was not forsaken. There was still a future, and in that future, God would make a way for the brokenness to be mended, for the relationship between man and Creator to be restored. The world was still groaning under the weight of its fall, but in the hearts of the faithful, there was a quiet, persistent hope. The journey back to the garden, to peace, to wholeness, had not yet ended. And though the road would be long, the faithful had the assurance that they were not walking it alone. As Seth's descendants continued to call on the name of the Lord, they found that their longing for God's presence was not in vain. It was the beginning of something more, a story that would unfold through the ages, until the day when the promise of redemption would be fully realized. And in that promise, the world would once again know peace. Click here to watch a video on the day the world almost ended.